Today, I'll be sharing what makes a better investment. One more expensive property or two smaller investment properties. I'll be sharing the criteria you need to go through to make the decision for yourself. But fair warning, what I share with you today might contradict what your friends and family are telling you, because what I'm about to share is based on my now 22 years of property investment experience and 14 years experience helping others invest in property. Hi, it's Nero here, and let me ask you a question. Why is it that so many of us, especially those of us who live in Sydney and Melbourne, think that we should only invest in our backyard? I speak to so many people from Melbourne who will say, yes, I've heard about how there are so many other markets around the country doing way better than Melbourne is, but I'd still want to know if I can buy something in Melbourne. Sydney-siders, well, we're even worse, right? I'm a Sydney-sider myself, and so many people from Sydney will say, oh yes, all the data sounds great, but can I buy in Sydney? Can I get something in Sydney for this budget? What about this particular suburb or that particular suburb? So the first thing to investigate is, why do we have a bias towards the two bigger capital cities? Well, the first answer to that is because the media primarily talks about what's going on in Sydney and Melbourne. Secondly, those of us who live in the two bigger cities, we're more comfortable buying in our bigger cities because we're making decisions not based on facts and figures, but based on emotion. And plus, especially for those of us who live in Sydney, isn't Sydney the city that's grown the most over the last 10, 20 years? And is it the market that's going to keep growing the most? Well, actually, if you look at the data, the answer is a clear no. So here we have data from Propertyology, one of the smartest researchers in the country when it comes to property investment. And what they've done is track the growth rates for Sydney and some other markets over the last 20 years. So what you can see here is in Sydney, over the last 20 years, in 13 of those 20 years, property prices rose. That means in 7 of those years, property prices either stayed flat or they fell. And over the last 20 years, the average annual rate of growth was 5.6%. But let's compare it to some of the other markets. Let's say Bendigo, regional market in Victoria. Property prices have risen 18 out of the last 20 years, and the average annual growth rate has been 5.9%. Launceston in Tasmania, prices have risen 16 out of the last 20 years, and the average annual rate has been 7.8%. And then we look at Cairns. Property prices have risen 16 out of 20 years, which means that the average annual rate is 5.8%. So you can clearly see that as good as Sydney has been, and of course Sydney's a strong market, prices have risen significantly, the fact is that there have been multiple markets that have outperformed Sydney. Now, of course, that's over the last 20 years. What about more recently? Here we have data from CoreLogic. And when we look at the last 12 months, we can see that Sydney prices did extremely well. Property prices have risen on average 10.9% in the last 12 months. It's been a boom market. But then look at Brisbane, which has outperformed Sydney at 15.3%. Adelaide, say roughly the same at 11%. And Perth at 17.5%. So just comparing the capital cities, excluding some of the regional markets, which have also done way better than Sydney, if you bought a property in Sydney 12 months ago and it was roughly a medium price property, you would have got less growth than if you bought in other markets that are also far cheaper. But that's the last 12 months. Now, if we are looking at 2024, the question is, well, should you buy in a more expensive market or a slightly lower price market? Well, have a look at the data here for what's been happening in the last month, again from CoreLogic. You can see Sydney prices are essentially flat, price growth of 0.3%. Melbourne's actually falling 0.1%. I expect Melbourne prices will continue to fall for quite some time, in generally speaking. So for those of you who live in Melbourne and think you should spend $1.2 million in Melbourne, be careful. I'm not expecting you to see a lot of price growth this year. But then look at Brisbane, 0.8%. Adelaide, 1%. Perth, 1.5%. There are clearly multiple markets right now as we enter 2024 that are rising far more quickly than Sydney is or Melbourne is. But then the question is, well, okay, if you do decide to buy in some of these more expensive markets for, say, $1.2 million, what can you actually get for that kind of price? Well, here we have data from Domain, and we're looking at the median price in each of our capital cities. What you can see that as of December last year, Sydney median property prices was $1.6 million. So essentially for 1.2 million, you're going to be struggling to find anything. I'll go through some of the suburbs where you can get something at 1.2 million in just a moment. Melbourne, yes, you can get something for 1.2 million, but then look at Brisbane and Adelaide. Far easier to get something there that's more affordable. Canberra is at $1 million. Perth, Hobart, Darwin, all very, very affordable. But then if we look at the quarterly price changes, so the last 3 months, so we're trying to work out really at the moment, where is the best place for you to put your money? At least what sort of price ranges and what sort of areas should we be looking at? So we're not just looking at what's been happening over the last several years, we're also looking at what's happened in the last month, last 3 months. And what we can see here is that Sydney property prices have risen 2%, Melbourne only 0.9%, but Brisbane 3.7%, nearly double what Sydney's market is doing. Adelaide 3.3%, well above Sydney's. Canberra dropping quite badly at 3.5% for the last quarter. Perth a whopping 4.4%. Hobart 2%. Darwin property prices dropping 1.2%. And then if we look at the areas, say within Sydney, where you can get property for under $1.2 million, we don't have too many choices, right? I mean, here we have the Sydney median property prices by region. We're looking at houses here, and you can see that you're going to struggle. I mean, we might be able to get you something in Parramatta, even though the median price is above 1.2 million. You have then Blacktown at 1 million, but just because it's affordable, then does that mean that you should be buying in Blacktown? Well, look at the quarterly price change. Property prices are only up 1%. So in other words, even though Blacktown is more affordable than most parts of Sydney, the growth rate in Blacktown is less than the median growth rate for all of Sydney and way less than what you could have got in terms of capital growth in just the last quarter had you bought in places like Brisbane, Adelaide or Perth, and certainly some regional markets. And then if we keep going down this table, we end up looking at the southwest of Sydney, where yes, price growth was good in the last quarter at 5%, but then we're down to the outer southwest, central coast, and outer western Blue Mountains. So the fact is that there aren't too many options if you're looking at a budget of 1.2 million, even 1.4 million in Sydney. And then the question is, even if you can afford to get something at around 1.2 or 1.4 million dollars as an investment property in our more expensive markets like Sydney or even Melbourne, why would you? The capital growth figures show that you would do better by taking that money and buying something for far less than 1.4, far less than 1.2 million dollars, and buying something that's probably going to help you sleep at night because it's going to be so much cheaper, and buy in either a smaller capital city or in regional markets. But then there's something else to consider as well, right? Melbourne right now has the worst rental returns in the country. Sydney is second. Okay, so if you were to take your $1.2 million and buy something in Melbourne or Sydney, first of all, you're going to lose out in terms of getting maximum capital growth. But secondly, your cash flow is going to be almost destroyed, all right? You're going to be significantly negatively cash flowed. And so you need to ask yourself, well, why would I spend $1.2 million and buy one property in an area that's not growing the most, have all that extra debt, and not get anywhere near as much rental return? Wouldn't it be a safer and smarter decision for you to instead take that $1.2 million, cut it up into maybe 2 investment properties at approximately $600,000 each, and then do your research and buy in areas that are currently outperforming Sydney and Melbourne, plus get yourself much better rental returns so you get more capital growth and better rental returns. And mind you, many of these markets have such a rental crisis right now that properties are renting very, very quickly and for top dollar. So you're not going to even have that concern either. So in other words, you can get more capital growth, more rental income, and buy property for far less than 1.2 million, in fact, around about $600,000. Why wouldn't you do it? But there's a caveat here. Yes, of course, you need to do your research. You can't just buy an area just because it's priced at $600,000. You need to look at owner occupancy rates, supply versus demand, infrastructure, rentability, all these key factors. But here's something else I would caution you about. Yes, looking at something at $600,000, say 2 properties for 600 grand rather than one at $1.2 million makes sense for most property investors. But it does not make sense for many property investors to start looking at properties for say 300, 350 grand in most areas, because most of those areas, although they are cheap, although you can probably get some decent rental returns initially, at least on paper, many of them don't have the long-term capital growth factors necessary to ensure that you're getting an uptick on your property. Because to me, there is no point you buying a property for $350,000 today, and in 3 years' time, it's still worth $350,000. You may as well keep your money in the bank. Okay, let's just say it rises from $350,000 to $400,000. Well, that's nice, but it's not enough for you to then be able to really move forwards. Instead, you'd have been much better off looking at properties for say $600,000. And some of these areas, prices are rising on average $10,000 a month. Okay, and there's no doubt in my mind that in many of these areas, something you buy for $600,000 in 12 to 18 months could easily be worth $700,000 with increasing rents. That means you can get better capital growth, better rental returns if you target the right price points. You don't want to go too cheap. I certainly wouldn't be recommending looking at most areas that are priced at below $400,000, but at the same time, it makes almost no sense for most investors to be stretching themselves to buy something in Sydney or Melbourne for $1.2, $1.4 million, maxing out their borrowing capacity just because they feel that, oh, Sydney's always performed better, Melbourne's always performed better. That is not the case. The data I shared with you earlier on clearly shows that. Instead, look to cut up your borrowing capacity into maybe 2 properties at $600,000, $700,000, whatever the case is. And those are the areas that will give you far better returns from a rental perspective and a capital growth perspective. And if you're not sure how do you find these areas, check out the link in the description to get totally for free the digital version and audio version of my book. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.